The Imperium survives on one truth. The Emperor lives and protects mankind, but I found proof he's been dead for thousands of years, his soul dispersed into the warp long ago. When I revealed this, worlds burned and faith collapsed overnight. Now we face the question no one was prepared to answer. What happens when humanity discovers its God is gone? I was there when the truth broke the Imperium. When the golden lie that had sustained humanity for 10 millennia shattered like glass beneath the weight of undeniable revelation. My name is Inquisitor Odrin Vale of the Ordo Hereticus, and I am the man who killed hope. The irony is not lost on me that I pursued truth my entire life. I hunted heretics who twisted imperial doctrine. I purged cults who whispered of the false gods. I burned worlds to contain corruption, all in service to what I believed was the divine will of the God Emperor of mankind. And yet it was I who would ultimately prove there was no God watching over us at all. The first signs came during routine psychic interrogation of a captured navigator from House Belisarius. The navigator, a woman named Elara, had been found transmitting coded messages to a known heretical faction operating in the Segmentum Solar. During the mind scrape, our sanctioned psyker reported unusual interference, a pattern within the warp itself that seemed to emanate not from the navigator but from Terra. At first, I dismissed this as a defensive mechanism, some psychic trap laid by a trained mind. But when 3 more interrogations revealed the same pattern, I knew something was wrong. Each prisoner, regardless of their crime or origin, carried the same psychic imprint when their minds were open to scrutiny. A pattern that pointed toward Holy Terra, toward the Golden Throne itself. I remember the cold dread that filled me when I first considered the implications. I told myself it was impossible, that I was pursuing shadows, that this investigation would prove nothing but my own paranoia. How wrong I was. I requisitioned a ship, an old dictator-class cruiser called the Undaunted Truth. The name would prove prophetic in ways I could never have imagined. With a small retinue of trusted acolytes, I charted a course for Terra, using my inquisitorial authority to bypass the usual century-long waiting lists for planetary approach. Even for the Inquisition, reaching Terra is not a simple matter. The defenses around the cradle of humanity are the most formidable in the galaxy, layers upon layers of battle fleets, orbital platforms, and psychic wards. 3 days into our journey, my most trusted acolyte, Merithor Kane, came to my personal quarters. He had served with me for 22 years, a former Arbeits officer whose sense of justice had evolved beyond the rigid confines of imperial law. His face was drawn, the augmetic eye he had received after our mission to Phobos whirring as it adjusted to the dim light of my chamber. "My lord," he said, his voice low, even though we were alone. "I must ask about the nature of our investigation," the crew whispers. "They say we pursue evidence against the Emperor himself." I regarded him carefully. Kane had never questioned me before, never sought clarification beyond what was necessary for his duties. That he would do so now spoke volumes about the tension building aboard the ship. "We pursue the truth, Kane," I told him. "Nothing more, nothing less. It is our sacred duty as servants of the throne." His organic eye narrowed, the augmetic one remaining fixed and unblinking. "And if that truth is dangerous?" "All truth is dangerous," I replied. "That is why it must be controlled. That is why the Inquisition exists." He seemed unsatisfied with my answer but nodded and withdrew. I should have recognized the warning signs, should have seen that even my closest allies might falter if they knew what we were truly investigating. But I was consumed by the need to know, by the terrible suspicion growing in my mind. It took us 3 months to reach the Sol system, and by then the pattern had grown stronger. Our astropath, Malia, began to suffer nosebleeds and seizures as we approached. She said it was like hearing a scream that had been stretched across 10,000 years, only now beginning to fade into silence. I found her one night in the ship's small chapel, not praying as might be expected, but simply sitting in silence, staring at the gilded aquila mounted on the wall. Her pale eyes, clouded by the changes wrought when her psychic abilities had been discovered, turned toward me as I entered. "You should not proceed with this, Inquisitor," she said without preamble. "Some truths are not meant to be known, some doors not meant to be opened." "That is not for us to decide," I replied, taking a seat beside her on the hard wooden bench. "If there is a flaw in the Astronomicon, if there is something wrong with the Emperor's psychic beacon, it is our duty to discover it." She laughed. Then, a sound so rarely heard from her that it startled me. "A flaw? Is that what you believe we are sensing?" "No, my lord. Not a flaw. An absence. A void where once there was presence." Her words chilled me, but I pressed on. "What do you mean, Malia?" She turned those blind eyes toward me, and I swear I could feel her looking into me, through me. "I mean that what we are sensing is not the Emperor's presence changing or weakening. We are sensing the space where his presence once was but now is not, like a footprint in sand slowly being erased by the tide. I still believed, even then. I told myself that we were detecting some new manifestation of the Emperor's power, perhaps a reaction to a surge in chaos activity, perhaps a sign of his divine will expressing itself in a new way. I was desperate to believe anything but the truth. Upon reaching Terra, I invoked special dispensation to approach the Imperial Palace. This alone took weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering, calling in favors from Cardinal Hexus of the Ecclesiarchy and Lord Inquisitor Varn. During this time, I was forced to house my retinue in one of the countless orbital stations that crowded Terra's space. These stations were cities in themselves, each home to millions of souls who would live and die without ever setting foot on the sacred soil of humanity's birthplace. It was on one such station, Sentinel Primus, that we encountered the first signs of the unrest that would later consume the Imperium. A minor cult had taken root among the station's maintenance workers, spreading the heretical belief that the Emperor's light was fading, that his power was waning, and that humanity should prepare for a new age of darkness. Under normal circumstances, I would have purged the cult without hesitation, called upon the station's security forces to round up the heretics for interrogation and execution. But something stayed my hand. Their beliefs, though expressed in the superstitious language of the uneducated, echoed too closely the pattern we had detected. They spoke of dreams in which they saw the golden throne empty, of whispers they heard in the recycled air of the station telling them that their god was gone. I had one of the cult leaders brought to my quarters, a woman named Sira who had once been a mid-level administrator before falling into heresy. She showed no fear when my acolytes brought her before me, only a strange, serene acceptance. "You already know it is true, Inquisitor," she said before I could even begin my questioning. "That is why you have come to Terra. That is why you have not yet executed me and my brothers and sisters. You sense it too, the absence where he once was. How long have you been spreading these lies?" I demanded, ignoring her uncomfortably accurate assessment of my motives. "They are not lies," she replied calmly, "and I have not been spreading anything. The knowledge came to each of us separately, in dreams and quiet moments. We found each other, afterward, drawn together by the shared revelation." "And what exactly is this revelation?" I asked, my hand resting on the hilt of my power sword, ready to end her at the first sign of demonic influence. Her eyes met mine without wavering. "That the Emperor, beloved by all, is no longer present on the Golden Throne, that his spirit has departed, leaving only his physical form behind. That the light of the Astronomicon is maintained, not by his divine will, but by the sacrifice of thousands of souls." Her words were high heresy, yet they aligned perfectly with what our investigation had begun to suggest. I had her detained but not executed, planning to question her further after our visit to the palace. It was a decision I would later regret when the riots began. Eventually, we were granted permission to establish a listening post in one of the lower spires of the Sanctum Imperialis, still miles from the Golden Throne, but closer than most servants of the Imperium would ever come to, the Emperor's physical form. The journey to our assigned chamber took us through layers of security so dense and paranoid that it would have been comical in any other context. Retinal scans, gene tests, psychic probes, interrogation under truth serums, and examination by tech priests whose mechanical augmentations were designed specifically to detect any form of deception or contamination. At each checkpoint, I presented my inquisitorial rosette, invoked the authority of my office, and submitted to their tests with as much patience as I could muster. By the time we reached our destination, even Kane, with his unshakable composure, was showing signs of strain. "This place feels wrong, my lord," he whispered, as we were finally left alone in the small, dusty chamber that would be our base of operations. Not sacred, as I always imagined the Imperial Palace would be. Just wrong. I knew what he meant. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of decay that no amount of incense or sacred oils could mask. The corridors we had passed through were magnificent, of course, decorated with artistry beyond the capabilities of modern humanity. But beneath the grandeur was a feeling of hollowness, as if we were walking through the preserved corpse of a once-living civilization rather than its beating heart. Our chamber was Spartan but functional, equipped with cogitators and psychic focusing equipment that had been arranged according to my specifications. It had clearly been hastily repurposed for our use, data slates and mechanical components stacked haphazardly in corners, a layer of dust covering surfaces that should have been kept immaculately clean in such a sacred place. It was there, in this forgotten corner of the most revered structure in human space, that we began to unravel the truth. Our astropath linked with the equipment, and for the first time, we were able to isolate the pattern, to study it directly rather than through the distorted lens of a prisoner's mind. The process was agonizing for Malia. As she connected with the psychic focusing array, her body convulsed, blood streaming from her nose and ears. She screamed, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the confined space of our chamber. Kane moved to disconnect her, but I stopped him. We needed to know. We needed to see what she was seeing. "The Emperor," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "I see him, but he is not there. I see the golden throne, but it is empty. I see the light of the Astronomicon, but it is not his light. It burns. O throne, how it burns." Her words became increasingly incoherent, but the data flowing through the cogitators was crystal clear. What we found defied everything I had been taught to believe. The pattern was not a communication. It was not a command or a blessing or a manifestation of divine will. It was an absence, a void, a negative space where something massive had once existed but now was gone. Imagine a great stone dropped into a still pond. The stone itself might vanish beneath the surface, but the ripples it creates spread outward, revealing its passage. What we detected were the ripples of the Emperor's soul passing into the warp. Not recently, not in some sudden catastrophe, but slowly, gradually, over thousands of years, until almost nothing remained. I refused to accept it at first. I had the equipment dismantled and rebuilt. I brought in 3 more astropaths to confirm Malia's readings. I spent a fortune in resources and favors to obtain permission to access ancient monitoring stations that had recorded psychic activity around the throne for millennia. The data was conclusive. The psychic presence that was the Emperor of mankind, the god I had served my entire life, had been dissipating for thousands of years. What remained on the golden throne was little more than an empty vessel, a corpse around which the greatest lie in human history had been built. The Emperor was dead, perhaps had been truly dead since the confrontation with Horus. The psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, the guiding light that made warp travel possible, was not powered by his divine will but by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers every day. Their souls burned like fuel to maintain the illusion that he still watched over us. During those dark days of discovery, I saw my retinue begin to fracture. Kane remained loyal, his face grim but his resolve unshaken. "If this is the truth," he said, "then it changes nothing about our duty. We serve humanity, with or without a god to guide us. But others were not so steadfast. My second acolyte, Daimon Reth, a former scholar of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had joined the Inquisition after uncovering heretical tech practices on his Forge world, approached me with trembling hands and wide, frightened eyes. "This cannot be, my lord," he said, his voice breaking. "The Omnissiah cannot be gone. The machine god and the Emperor are one. If one is empty, what does that mean for the other?" I had no answer for him. The implications of our discovery extended far beyond matters of faith. The entire structure of the Imperium, its governance, its military, its economy, all rested on the belief in the Emperor's divinity and protection. If that belief was false, what would remain? I should have destroyed the evidence. I should have executed my retinue and then myself, taking the secret to our graves. That would have been the merciful thing to do. But I was an inquisitor. I had sworn to uncover the truth, no matter how terrible. And in my pride, in my shock, in my need to prove that what I had discovered was real, I did the unforgivable. I transmitted the evidence to a conclave of inquisitors, along with my findings. I expected debate. I expected denial. What I did not expect was for my transmission to be intercepted. To this day, I do not know who accessed our data first. Perhaps it was a tech priest monitoring communications. Perhaps it was a rogue element within the Inquisition itself. All I know is that within hours, the information had begun to spread, first as a whisper, then as a flood that not even the combined efforts of the Inquisition could contain. We were in our quarters when the first reports reached us. Civilian unrest in the habitation zones nearest the palace. Arbeit's units mobilizing to contain what was being described as a mass outbreak of hysteria. Kane entered my chamber without knocking, his face pale. "My lord, we need to leave. Now." He held out a data slate for me to view. On it was footage from a security-picked feed showing crowds surging through the streets of one of Terra's countless hive cities. They were chanting something, the audio too distorted to make out clearly, but the mood was unmistakably one of violent panic. "What are they saying?" I asked, though in my heart, I already knew. Kane swallowed hard. "They are saying the Emperor is dead, my lord. They are saying the throne is empty." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Faith is the foundation upon which the Imperium is built, not technology, not military might, but the shared belief in the divinity and protection of the Emperor. When that faith was suddenly, irrevocably undermined, the consequences were more devastating than any external enemy could have ever achieved. We barely made it back to our ship. The corridors of the palace, once rigidly controlled and orderly, had descended into chaos. Guards who should have been the most loyal, the most disciplined servants of the Imperium were abandoning their posts or worse, turning on their officers. Civilians who worked in the palace's countless administrative departments were either fleeing or forming into frantic mobs, demanding to know if what they had heard was true. I saw a cardinal of the ecclesiarchy torn apart by his own bodyguards. I saw tech priests smashing sacred cogitators with their own mechadendrites, ripping out their augmetic components as if suddenly unable to bear their presence within their flesh. I saw things that should not have been possible in the heart of humanity's empire, the center of its faith and governance. We reached our ship only to find Malia and 2 other astropaths dead in the shuttle bay, their bodies contorted in positions that spoke of agonizing final moments. Their faces were frozen in expressions of utter terror, their psychic hoods shattered as if they had tried to tear them off in desperation. "The backlash," Reth whispered, his face ashen as he examined the bodies. The psychic shock of millions of minds suddenly gripped by the same terrible realization. They felt it all at once. It would have been like a psychic bomb detonating in their minds. I watched from orbit as the first riots broke out across Terra. The Adeptus Arbites responded with their usual brutal efficiency, but they were quickly overwhelmed. When the ecclesiarchy attempted to dismiss the evidence as heresy, they found their words carried no weight. The very source of their authority had been proven false. Within days, the unrest had spread to nearby systems. The Astronomicon began to flicker as the psychers who maintained it, many drawn from the ranks of the faithful, lost their will to sacrifice themselves for what they now knew to be a corpse. Warp travel became increasingly dangerous, isolating systems from one another just as they needed unity most. From our position in high orbit, we could see the waves of violence spreading across Terra's surface like a disease. Entire hive cities were burning, the flames visible even from space. Orbital defense platforms were going dark one by one, their crews either dead or fled or turned to new masters. Ships of the Imperial Navy were breaking formation, some moving to protect civilian vessels, others turning their weapons on former comrades. I received a transmission from Lord Inquisitor Varn, his face haggard and his voice hoarse from what must have been hours of shouting. "What have you done, Vale? In the Emperor's name, what have you done?" The irony of his invocation was not lost on me. "I discovered the truth, my lord, as was my duty." His laugh was bitter and broken. Your duty was to protect the Imperium, not destroy it. Do you have any idea what is happening down there? The Adeptus Custodes have sealed the inner sanctum of the palace. They are executing anyone who approaches, even high-ranking members of the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy. The Adeptus Mechanicus representatives on Terra have declared the Omnissiah dead and the treaty with Mars void. Half the planetary defense grid is offline, and we have reports of chaos cults emerging in every hive city, drawing in millions of desperate souls seeking any god who will answer their prayers. I had no response for him. What could I say that would justify the apocalypse I had inadvertently unleashed? If you have any loyalty left to humanity, Vale, you will use what forum, influence you still possess to help contain this. Find a way to counter the evidence. Claim it was falsified. Claim it was a test of faith. Claim anything that might slow the collapse. But it was already too late. The evidence was irrefutable, and it had spread too far, too fast. The Imperium's own communication networks, designed to transmit the Emperor's will and the Administratum's dictates across the galaxy, had become the vectors of their undoing. The Adeptus Mechanicus was the first major Imperial organization to fracture. Many tech priests had always viewed the Emperor as the Omnissiah, the machine god incarnate. With proof that he was gone, their faith collapsed into chaos. Some maintained that the corpse on the throne was still sacred, a perfect machine that must be preserved at all costs. Others declared that the time had come to transcend biological divinity entirely, to embrace a purely mechanical godhead. Wars erupted across Forge worlds as these factions turned their terrible weapons against one another. On the third day after the revelation had begun to spread, we received a transmission from Mars. It was heavily degraded, the signal breaking up frequently, but we could see that the surface of the red planet was aflame. The great forges that had produced the Imperium's weapons and ships for millennia were now producing only the tools of their own destruction. A tech priest appeared on the view screen, his face mostly replaced with augmetics, but his remaining human eye wide with what might have been religious ecstasy or utter madness. "The Omnissiah is dead," he intoned, his voice layered with mechanical harmonics. "The union of flesh and machine has failed. We must become as gods ourselves, perfect our forms beyond the flawed vision of the false Omnissiah. Mars calls upon all true servants of the machine god to cast aside the shackles of the Imperium and embrace the transcendent Mechanicum." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by another, this one from a tech priest whose augmentations were more subdued, almost concealed beneath his crimson robes. "This is Archmagos Delphin Grus to all loyal servants of the Omnissiah. Disregard all transmissions from the heretic Kelbor Hal. The physical form of the Omnissiah remains upon the Golden Throne. Though his consciousness may have evolved beyond our understanding, his sacred vessel must be preserved. Mars remains loyal to Terra and the true Mechanicum. All forces of the Omnissiah are hereby ordered to defend the sacred forges against the transcendent heresy." The Space Marine chapters, those demigods of war created from the Emperor's own genetic legacy, reacted in ways as varied as their origins. Some, like the Imperial Fists and Ultramarines, doubled down on their oaths of loyalty, declaring that they served the Imperium itself, not the divinity of the Emperor. Others fell into despair or rage. The Blood Angels and their successors suffered a mass onset of the Black Rage, thousands of warriors succumbing to the genetic memory of their Primarch's anguish. The Space Wolves simply withdrew to Fenris, their great fleet vanishing into the increasingly treacherous warp. We intercepted a Vox transmission between the Master of the Imperial Fists, Chapter Master Vaughn Hagen, and what appeared to be a representative of the Adeptus Custodes. The audio was poor, but the content was clear enough. The Imperial Fists stand ready to defend the palace, as we have always done. Hagen's voice was firm, unshaken. The truth about the Emperor's state changes nothing about our duty. The custodian's reply was cold, almost mechanical in its precision. Your service is not required, Chapter Master. The Imperial Palace is the domain of the Custodian Guard. We neither require nor request your assistance. With respect, Shield Captain, the situation on Terra is deteriorating rapidly. The outer precincts of the palace are already under attack from rioters and what appear to be organized cult forces. My chapter stands ready to establish a defensive perimeter that would relieve pressure on your forces and allow you to focus on the inner sanctums. There was a long pause before the custodian responded. The Emperor's physical form remains on the Golden Throne, Chapter Master. So long as that is the case, the Custodian Guard will fulfill its ancient duty to protect him. If the Astartes wish to prove their loyalty, they will maintain order in the wider Imperium and prevent this contagion of doubt from spreading further. The transmission ended, leaving us to wonder what was truly happening within the innermost circles of the Imperial Palace. Did the Custodes still believe in the Emperor's divinity, or were they simply following the letter of their ancient charge to protect his physical form regardless of whether his spirit remained? Most devastating was the reaction among the Imperial Guard and Navy. Entire regiments and battle groups declared independence, swearing allegiance to their own worlds or commanders rather than the empty throne on Terra. Others turned to new faiths, whether the ruinous powers of chaos or local deities long suppressed by imperial doctrine. We received reports of guard regiments turning on one another, of naval battle groups engaging in ship-to-ship combat. The command structure of the Imperium's military forces, always tenuous across such vast distances, collapsed almost completely. Without the unifying symbol of the Emperor, without the absolute authority of Terra, local commanders were free to interpret their duty as they saw fit, and many saw fit to seize power for themselves. One particularly disturbing report came from the Cadian Gate, where the Imperial forces tasked with holding back the tide of chaos from the Eye of Terror were suddenly divided against themselves. General Mindorus Odon, commander of the Cadian 8th Regiment, declared his forces loyal to the Imperium of Man, not the corpse on Terra. In response, Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed ordered his execution for heresy. The resulting conflict left the Cadian defenses weakened at the very moment when Chaos forces, sensing the disruption in the Imperium, began to launch new offensives. I watched it all from the observation deck of the Undaunted Truth as we drifted in high orbit. The ship's captain, a grim man named Horst who had served the Inquisition for 40 years, asked me what our course should be. I had no answer for him. What does one do after unintentionally committing the greatest act of heresy imaginable? Where does one go when the center of the universe has been proven hollow? The crew is asking questions, my lord, Horst said, his voice carefully neutral. They want to know if it is true, if the Emperor is truly gone. I looked out at Terra, watching as flashes of weapons fire illuminated the night side of the planet. What would you have me tell them, Captain? A comforting lie or the devastating truth? He considered this for a long moment. I have served the Imperium all my life, my lord. I have never questioned its teachings or its structure, but I have always believed that what I served ultimately was humanity itself. If the Emperor is gone, humanity remains. It still needs protection, perhaps now more than ever. His words struck a chord within me. Yes, the Emperor might be gone, but humanity endured. And if the Imperium as we knew it could not survive this revelation, perhaps something new could emerge from its ashes. Something more honest, more resilient. For days, I watched the death throes of Terra, the cradle of humanity descending into madness and civil war. Orbital platforms turned their weapons on one another. The great space docks burned. The endless stream of supply ships that kept the planet fed dwindled and then stopped entirely. Billions would starve in the coming weeks, but that was just the beginning of the horror. The warp itself seemed to be responding to the collective psychological trauma of trillions of human minds suddenly confronted with the death of their god. Astropathic communications became increasingly distorted, filled with whispers and screams that had nothing to do with the intended message. Reports began to emerge of demonic manifestations, not just in the usual places at the fringes of imperial control, but in the heart of supposedly secure worlds. On the 5th day, we lost contact with several key systems near Terra. The astropathic relays simply went silent, as if the worlds themselves had ceased to exist. Long-range auger arrays detected massive energy spikes consistent with void shield failures and weapons discharges on a planetary scale. On the 6th day, we observed a fleet of ships approaching Terra from the outer system. They were not Imperial vessels, their profiles matching nothing in our recognition databases. As they drew closer, our auger operators reported energy readings consistent with Xenos technology, specifically Aeldari in origin. They made no hostile moves, simply taking up position in high orbit, observing the chaos unfolding on Terra as we were. I considered attempting to communicate with them but decided against it. What could I possibly say to explain what was happening? How could I justify to an alien race that humanity had built its entire civilization on a lie, and now that lie had been exposed? It was on the 7th day after my transmission that I made my decision. There was no undoing what had been done. The truth was loose in the galaxy now, spreading faster than any plague. But perhaps there was something to be salvaged from the ruins of faith. If the Emperor was not a god, then what was he? What was the power that had sustained the Astronomicon for 10 millennia, however diminished it had become? There were answers still to be found, and in those answers might lie some hope for humanity's survival. I gave Captain Horst our destination, Mars. If anyone might have records of what the Emperor truly was, of the technology that had created and sustained the Golden Throne, it would be the Adeptus Mechanicus. And in the chaos of their doctrinal civil war, their archives might be accessible as never before. Our navigator, a woman named Elana, whose family had served the Inquisition for generations, looked troubled when I informed her of our destination. "The warp is turbulent, my lord," she said, her third eye hidden behind an ornate golden diadem, but her expression clearly concerned. "The Astronomicon flickers like a candle in a storm. I cannot guarantee a safe passage, even to a destination as close as Mars." "Do what you can," I told her. "The knowledge we seek may be the only hope humanity has left." As we broke orbit, navigating through the debris of orbital battles, I took one last look at Terra. The birthplace of humanity was burning, the atmosphere visibly darkened by smoke even from space. In my arrogance, in my dedication to truth, I had done what countless enemies of mankind had failed to do across 10 millennia. I had struck at the heart of human faith and found it all too fragile. The journey to Mars should have taken hours. In the increasing turbulence of the warp, with the Astronomicon flickering like a candle in a storm, it took us nearly 2 weeks. Our navigator emerged from each translation between real space and the Immaterium more strained, more haggard. After the final jump that brought us into Mars orbit, she collapsed, blood streaming from beneath her diadem. "Something is changing in the warp," she whispered as the Medicae attended to her. "Something vast is stirring, my lord. I felt it watching us, following our passage, not hostile, not yet, but aware. Aware in a way I have never sensed before." When we finally arrived, we found the red planet in little better state than Terra. The great forge cities were at war with one another, the sky dark with the smoke of industry turned to destruction. Orbital platforms exchanged fire above the planet's surface, while on the ground, cohorts of Skitarii marched against one another, their weapons leaving swathes of destruction across Mars' ancient deserts. Using my inquisitorial codes that might soon become meaningless in this new reality, I made contact with Magos Delphan Gruss, an ancient tech priest who had once assisted my investigation into corrupted STC fragments. If anyone would grant me access and protection, it would be him. His response was cautious but curious. He arranged for us to dock at Olympus Mons, the greatest forge city on Mars and the seat of the Fabricator General himself, or rather, what remained of it. As we approached, I could see that significant damage had been done to the upper levels of the city. Great craters marred the slopes of the extinct volcano, and the orbital docks showed signs of recent and intense combat. Our shuttle was met by a squadron of Mechanicus gunships, which escorted us through a debris field of shattered vessels and drifting bodies. The void around Mars was as contested as its surface, with ships bearing the insignia of rival forge cities engaged in brutal close-range combat. We passed the wreckage of what must have been a mighty battleship, its spine broken and its decks exposed to vacuum, the bodies of its crew floating among the ruins of their vessel. We were met by a contingent of Skitarii warriors, their red robes dusty and torn, their weapons bearing the marks of recent use. They escorted us through corridors littered with the remains of both men and machines. Servitors continued their programmed tasks, stepping over the bodies of the fallen with mechanical indifference. The air smelled of copper and burnt plastic, the familiar scent of the Mechanicus tinged with the newer smell of slaughter. At one junction, we came upon a scene that encapsulated the civil war consuming Mars. A group of tech priests lay dead, their augmetic components scattered across the floor as if they had been systematically disassembled. Standing over them was a servitor, its organic components almost entirely replaced with machinery, continuing to sweep the floor as it had been programmed to do, oblivious to the carnage around it or the fact that its cleaning implement was smearing the blood rather than removing it. Magos Gruss received us in what had once been a librarium but now served as his command center. His body was a masterpiece of mechanical augmentation, little flesh visible save for a single piercing gray eye. Mechadendrites writhed around him like metallic serpents, interfacing with various cogitators and data terminals. "Inquisitor Vale," he greeted me, his voice a synthesized monotone. "You have created quite a disturbance in the cosmos." I did not deny it. "I seek knowledge, Magos, about the Emperor, about what he truly was." "Was," Gruss repeated. "Not is. You have already made your determination." "The evidence is irrefutable," I said. "His psychic presence has been dissipating for millennia. What remains on the throne is not what the Imperium has worshipped." The Mechadendrites stilled for a moment. "The implications of your discovery extend beyond matters of faith, Inquisitor. They strike at the very foundations of the Mechanicus. The Omnissiah and the Emperor have been one and the same in our doctrine for 10,000 years. If one is gone, then what does that mean for your machine god?" I finished for him. "That is partly why I have come. Not just to learn what the Emperor was, but what remains, what humanity might still preserve." Gruss made a sound that might have been a laugh, a static burst from his vox emitter. "Preservation. Yes, that is the question that divides us now. What is worth preserving? The physical form on the throne, the technologies that have kept it animate, or the knowledge that came before, the true understanding of the Omnissiah that predates the union with Imperial doctrine? And where do you stand, Magos?" His single organic eye fixed on me. "I stand with knowledge, Inquisitor, as I always have. The truth may burn down our civilization, but from its ashes, a more honest one might rise, if we survive that long." He gestured toward a display screen showing tactical data from across Mars. Red icons representing enemy forces surrounded the Forge City on all sides. The Moirae faction gains ground daily, They believe that the machine god exists independently of the Emperor, that his supposed death is irrelevant to their faith. Others, like the disciples of Kelbor Hal, see this as an opportunity to elevate the Mechanicus above all other imperial institutions, to establish a purely technological empire free from the superstitions of flesh. And you disagree with both? Gruss's mechadendrites writhed in what might have been the mechanical equivalent of a shrug. I believe that understanding must precede faith. We cannot decide what to believe until we know what is true. That is why I will grant you access to our archives, Inquisitor. Not because I share your conclusions, but because I share your desire to know. He granted us access to a secure data vault deep beneath the Forge City. While skirmishes raged above, we descended into the cool darkness of Mars' ancient catacombs. The vault contained archives dating back to the dark age of technology, preserved in formats so old that the Mechanicus had been forced to maintain the machines to read them rather than transfer the data to newer systems. The journey to the vault took us through layers of security that would have been impenetrable under normal circumstances. But the Civil War had drawn away many of the defenders, and Gruss's authority, though diminished, was still sufficient to grant us passage. We descended in an ancient elevator, the mechanism grinding and protesting as it carried us deeper into the red planet's crust. These archives predate the heresy, Gruss explained as we descended. Some even predate the Great Crusade. They contain knowledge that has been deemed too dangerous or too sacred for general access, even within the higher echelons of the Mechanicus. And you have access to them? I asked. I have access to the access protocols, he replied. Whether the systems will still recognize my authority after recent events remains to be seen. The elevator finally came to a halt, and we stepped out into a vast chamber filled with data storage devices of every conceivable type and age. Some were recognizable as crystal matrices or hololithic arrays. Others were strange, alien-looking constructs that pulsed with their own internal energy. The air was cold, maintained at precisely the temperature needed to preserve the ancient technology. "This is the Librarium Omnis," Gruss said, his voice hushed despite his voximeter. "The All-Library. Here, the Mechanicus has preserved knowledge deemed too valuable to lose, but too dangerous to use. Fragments of STCs, Xenotech analysis, records from the dark age of technology, and documentation of the Emperor's early work with what would become the Golden Throne." My acolyte Reth let out a small gasp at the sight of it. As a former tech priest, he understood better than any of us the value of what we were seeing. "Magos, this is beyond priceless. The knowledge contained here could advance the Imperium by millennia. Or destroy what remains of it," Gruss replied. "Knowledge is not inherently beneficial, Adept Reth. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends on how it is used." For 3 days and nights, we sifted through the archives, aided by servitors programmed with specialized search algorithms. The information was fragmented, corrupted by time and by deliberate redaction, but slowly we began to piece together a picture of the truth. What we found there, pieced together from fragments of ancient history and technical specifications, was both more mundane and more extraordinary than the myth of the god, Emperor. The being that became known as the Emperor was indeed ancient, possibly the oldest human to have ever lived. Born in ancient Terra's past, he was what might be called a perpetual, effectively immortal, his body able to regenerate from any wound. But more significant was his psychic power, unmatched in human history. One fragment, a personal journal entry dated from the late age of strife, provided a glimpse into the mind of the being who would become the Emperor. "I have walked among humanity for millennia, guiding when I could, observing when I must. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have witnessed the birth of religions and their inevitable corruption. I have seen how belief shapes reality, how faith can both elevate and destroy. The time for subtle guidance has passed. The warp grows more turbulent, more malevolent. The Old One's legacy has festered into something terrible. If humanity is to survive, it must be united under a single purpose, a single vision, not faith, but reason, not superstition, but understanding. The project beneath the palace must be completed. The human webway will free us from dependency on warp travel, shield us from the predations of the immaterium. This is my gift to humanity, the true path to our ascension. The Golden Throne itself was revealed to be a device of incredible complexity, designed not as an instrument of godhood, but as a desperate measure. A life support system, a psychic amplifier, and a seal upon the human webway project the Emperor had been constructing beneath the imperial palace. When he was mortally wounded by Horus, the throne became his prison, keeping his physical form alive while his psychic essence began the slow process of dissolution. Technical schematics of the throne showed a device far more complex than even the Mechanicus had understood. It was not merely a life support system or a psychic amplifier. It was a conduit, a bridge between real space and the warp, designed to channel and focus psychic energy on a scale previously thought impossible. But it was also a cage, a containment device meant to prevent something from either entering or leaving the immaterium. "These specifications are incomplete," Reth said, studying the fragmented data. "It's as if whoever designed this deliberately obscured certain aspects of its function. But from what I can see, the throne was never meant to be a permanent installation. It was a temporary measure, a stopgap until something else could be completed." "The human webway," I suggested, recalling the journal entry. Reth nodded. "Possibly, or something else entirely. What's clear is that the Golden Throne, as we understand it today, is not operating as originally intended. It's been modified, adapted, over millennia to serve purposes its creator never envisioned. But perhaps most shocking was the evidence that the Emperor himself never claimed divinity. The imperial cult, the religious veneration of the Emperor as a god, was a development that came after his internment on the throne, a political tool to unify humanity under a single faith. The Emperor's original vision was of a secular human empire, free from the corrupting influence of both religion and the warp entities that fed on belief. We found records of the early Imperium, before the heresy, when the imperial truth was the official doctrine. The explicit rejection of religion, the emphasis on reason and human potential rather than faith and divine intervention. The Emperor had actively opposed his own worship, seeing it as a dangerous regression to the superstitions that had nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife. The irony was suffocating. The greatest lie of the Imperium had been built upon the Emperor's greatest defeat. In his final battle, he had not only lost his physical mobility, but had been forced to witness, in whatever diminished consciousness remained, the perversion of his vision into exactly what he had fought to prevent. As I sat amid the ancient data stacks, absorbing the magnitude of what we had discovered, I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the faith that had sustained me throughout my life, but for the vision that had been lost. The Emperor had not sought godhood or worship. He had sought to elevate humanity beyond its superstitions, to free it from the very religious fervor that would later be directed toward him. Cain found me there, surrounded by data slates and hololithic projections. His face was grim, but there was a new resolve in his eyes. "What will you do with this knowledge, my lord?" I looked up at him, suddenly aware of how tired I was. "What can be done, Cana? The damage is already wrought. The Imperium is tearing itself apart. Adding this knowledge to what has already been revealed would only deepen the wounds." "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps it would offer a new path. The Emperor sought to free humanity from religion, to elevate us through reason and understanding. That vision was lost when he was interred on the Golden Throne, when the imperial truth was replaced by the imperial cult. But it need not remain lost." I considered his words. Could the Emperor's original vision be reclaimed from the ashes of the Imperium? Could humanity rebuild around the principles of reason and secular progress rather than faith and dogma? It seemed an impossible task, especially now, with the galaxy in flames and the forces of chaos surely taking advantage of the confusion. On the fourth day, our research was interrupted by the sounds of battle drawing closer. Magos Grus contacted us via Vox, his transmission filled with static. Inquisitor Vale, you must leave immediately. The Forge City has fallen to the Moire faction. They seek the destruction of all records pertaining to the Emperor's divinity. Your presence here will only accelerate their assault on the archives. I argued, of course. We had only just begun to understand the full implications of what we had discovered. But Grus was insistent. Take what data you have collected. I have prepared a ship for your escape. The knowledge must survive, even if we do not. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. We hastily gathered what records we could, downloading them into portable data crystals. My retinue, now reduced to Malia the Astropath, 2 trusted acolytes, and a combat servitor, prepared for our escape. As we made our way back through the catacombs, we could hear the sounds of battle growing louder, the distinctive whine of phosphor weapons and the deeper boom of more conventional explosives. The elevator that had brought us down to the archives was no longer functioning, its power cut off during the assault on the Forge City. We were forced to ascend via emergency ladders built into the shaft, a climb of nearly a kilometer through darkness broken only by the dim glow of lumens attached to our equipment. Halfway up, we heard the elevator car above us come loose from its moorings, plummeting down the shaft toward us. We pressed ourselves against the wall, feeling the rush of air as the massive metal box hurtled past, crashing into the depths below with a sound that reverberated through the entire structure. "They're destroying the archives," Reth said, his voice tight with horror. "They're burying the knowledge rather than let it contradict their beliefs." We emerged into chaos. The upper levels of the Forge City were in flames, Skitarii fighting Skitarii among the burning data stacks and toppled monuments to the machine god. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh and hot metal. Servitors continued their programmed tasks amid the destruction, oblivious to the fact that the civilization they served was consuming itself. We ran for the landing platforms, keeping to cover as much as possible. Twice we were forced to fight, my acolytes proving their worth as they cut down rogue tech priests with well-placed bolter fire. The combat servitor moved with mechanical precision, its built-in weapons cutting through enemy Skitarii with brutal efficiency. The ship Grus had promised was there, a small but swift Mechanicus transport, its engines already cycling to readiness. As we sprinted across the platform, exposed to enemy fire, I saw Malia stumble. I turned back for her, only to watch in horror as a phosphor round struck her square in the chest. She burst into white-hot flame, her body consumed in seconds by the voracious chemical fire. The data crystal she had been carrying, containing a third of our precious findings, melted to slag in the conflagration. "My lord, we must go now," Kane shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the waiting ship. I resisted for a moment, staring at the spot where Malia had stood. Then reason reasserted itself, and I ran with him toward our escape. There was no time to mourn. The rest of us reached the ship and were airborne within moments, the pilot servitor executing evasive maneuvers as anti-aircraft fire tracked our ascent. Through the viewport, I could see the Forge City burning beneath us, centuries of accumulated knowledge and technology going up in flames. As we broke through Mars' thin atmosphere into the void of space, I allowed myself a moment of grief for Malia. She had been with me for 15 years, her psychic abilities and unwavering loyalty making her one of my most valued acolytes. Now she was gone, another casualty in the collapse of Imperial truth. The void around Mars was a battlefield, ships of rival Forge cities engaged in point-blank exchanges of fire. We wove through the conflict, our small vessel's size and speed, our only advantages against the much larger and more heavily armed combatants. The pilot servitor, programmed for just such emergency extractions, performed its function flawlessly, using the larger battles as cover for our escape. Once clear of the immediate danger, we faced a new problem. Where to go? Terra was in flames. Mars was, consumed by civil war, and reports from across the system suggested that similar conflicts were erupting on every Imperial world. The Astronomicon was now flickering erratically, making warp travel increasingly dangerous. Even if we could navigate safely, what destination would offer sanctuary to the man who had shattered the Imperium's foundation? But there was no time to dwell on losses. We needed a destination, somewhere to process what we had learned, to consider its implications for humanity's future. I thought of remote research stations, isolated shrine worlds, even Xenos space where the turmoil of the Imperium might not yet have reached. In the end, I chose the one place that might still maintain some semblance of order, a place whose inhabitants had always valued truth above comfort. The fortress monastery of the Grey Knights on Titan, moon of Saturn. The Grey Knights were unique among the Adeptus Astartes. Created specifically to combat the forces of chaos, they were among the few Imperial servants who had always known at least part of the truth about the nature of the warp and its denizens. Their faith was not in the Emperor's divinity, but in humanity's need for protection from far worse powers. If anyone might hear my findings with rationality rather than hysteria, it would be them. If anyone might know what to do in the wake of this shattering revelation, it would be the warrior psychers who had gazed into the abyss of chaos and remained unbowed. Our navigator, still weak from the strain of our journey to Mars, looked doubtful when I told her our destination. "The warp grows more turbulent by the hour, my lord," she said. "Without the Astronomicon to guide us, even a journey within the same system is fraught with danger." "We have no choice," I told her. "The knowledge we carry is too important to lose. It may be the only hope humanity has left." The journey to Titan was fraught with danger. The warp storms around Terra were intensifying as faith collapsed and fear took hold. Without the steadying influence of the Astronomicon, which was now failing entirely as the Psyker sacrifices ceased, navigation was nearly impossible. Our Mechanicus transport had only minimal warp capability, designed for short jumps within a system rather than interplanetary travel. We were forced to make a series of short, dangerous jumps, each one bringing us closer to Saturn, but also risking our destruction in the increasingly turbulent Immaterium. During one such jump, we lost contact with one of my acolytes, Jerick, who had been in a different compartment when the Geller field fluctuated. When we returned to real space, all that remained of him was a smear of organic matter on the walls and a lingering smell of ozone. The navigator emerged from each translation more haggard, more drained. "There is something in the warp," she whispered after our third jump, "something vast and golden. I cannot tell if it is hunting us or guiding us, but it is aware. Aware in a way that no warp predator has ever been." Her words sent a chill through me. Could it be that the Emperor's consciousness, though no longer anchored to his physical form on the Golden Throne, had not dissipated entirely? Could some fragment of his being still exist in the Immaterium, watching as his empire collapsed? By the time we reached Titan, our ship was barely functional, its hull breached in multiple places and sealed with emergency measures. The remaining crew consisted of myself, my last acolyte, Kel, and the combat servitor, its organic components beginning to rot despite the preservative measures built into its design. Titan loomed before us, a grey orb wreathed in the storms of Saturn's rings. I transmitted my inquisitorial codes, half expecting them to be rejected, for the Grey Knights to have decided that the Inquisition itself was compromised by the revelation of the Emperor's true state. To my surprise, we received immediate clearance to approach the Access, Fortress Monastery, along with coordinates for a secure landing bay. As we made our descent, I caught my first glimpse of the monastery itself, a massive structure of dark adamantine and marble that seemed to grow out of Titan's barren surface. Gun emplacements tracked our approach, but held their fire. Servo skulls flitted around our damaged vessel as we set down, scanning for threats or contamination. We were met by a contingent of Grey Knights, their Terminator armor making them seem more like walking tanks than men. Their silver plate was inscribed with sacred texts and wards against chaos, their weapons thrumming with contained power. Despite their fearsome appearance, they treated us with formal courtesy, escorting us from the landing bay to a secure chamber deep within the monastery. The corridors we passed through were lined with trophies from countless battles against the forces of chaos. Daemon weapons sealed in stasis fields, their malevolent energy contained but still palpable. Banners taken from traitor legions, their heretical symbols deliberately defaced. The severed heads of creatures too terrible to name, preserved in transparent cases filled with bubbling fluids. Throughout our journey deeper into the fortress, I was struck by the absolute order that prevailed. There was none of the panic or confusion that had gripped Terra and Mars. The Grey Knights moved with purpose and discipline, their expressions serene beneath their helmets or stern but composed when their faces were visible. It was as if the revelation that had shattered the wider Imperium had not touched them at all. There, I was brought before Grand Master Valdar Oricon, the leader of the Grey Knights chapter. He received me in a Spartanly furnished chamber, the walls lined with tomes of forbidden knowledge and relics of past victories against the ruinous powers. Unlike many chapter masters, he wore no ornate artificer armor, just the same silver Terminator plate as his battle brothers, though his was distinguished by a red hooded cape that framed his severe features. "Inquisitor Vale," he greeted me, his voice deep and resonant. "Your discovery has reached even here." I was taken aback. "You know, we have maintained communication with certain elements of the Inquisition, yes, and we have our own ways of perceiving disturbances in the warp. The psychic shockwave of collapsed faith has been felt by every battle brother with psychic sensitivity." He gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit. You have traveled far and at great risk." I sat, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that had settled into my bones. "Then you understand the implications of what I found. Perhaps better than you do yourself," Oricon said. "The Emperor's divinity, or lack thereof, has never been the foundation of our chapter's purpose. We were created to stand against the ruinous powers, the true gods who seek humanity's destruction. That duty remains unchanged, regardless of the Emperor's true nature." His words stunned me. Here, in the heart of one of the most secretive and elite forces in the Imperium, was a leader who seemed entirely unshaken by the revelation that had toppled governments and sparked civil wars across the galaxy. "You do not worship the Emperor as a god?" I asked. Oricon's expression remained impassive. "We honor him as the creator of our chapter, as the greatest psyker humanity has ever produced, and as the being whose sacrifice has held the forces of chaos at bay for 10 millennia. But worship? No. We have always known too much about the warp and its denizens to mistake any being, no matter how powerful, for a true deity. But the Imperium is tearing itself apart," I argued. "Without the unifying belief in the Emperor's divine protection, without the Astronomicon to guide our ships, human civilization will collapse." Oricon's expression remained impassive. "Perhaps. Or perhaps something new will emerge from the ashes, something more honest, more resilient." He rose and moved to a viewport that looked out over Titan's desolate landscape. "What concerns me more is not the loss of a false god, but the potential rise of true ones. As faith in the Emperor collapses, humans will seek new objects of worship. The ruinous powers stand ready to receive them." I felt a chill at his words. In my focus on the immediate consequences of my discovery, I had given little thought to the long-term implications for the soul of humanity. If the Emperor had indeed been holding chaos at bay through the collective faith of mankind, what would happen now that faith was shattered? "Already, we have reports of increased chaos cult activity across multiple sectors," Oricon continued. "Worlds that had been stable for millennia are suddenly seeing mass conversions to the worship of the dark gods. The barriers between real space and the warp grow thin. Daemonic incursions are becoming more frequent, more powerful. Then what is to be done?" I asked. "How does humanity survive this?" Oricon turned back to me, his eyes reflecting the cold light of distant stars. "That, Inquisitor Vale, is the question we have gathered to address. You are not the only one to seek refuge here. Representatives from various imperial organizations have made their way to Titan in recent weeks. The Inquisition, the Administratum, even elements of the Ecclesiarchy who value survival over doctrine. He led me from the chamber through long corridors of polished stone. Servitors and chapter serfs moved purposefully about their duties, showing none of the panic or confusion that had gripped other imperial institutions. The discipline of the fortress monastery remained intact, a small island of order in a galaxy descending into chaos. We passed chambers where Grey Knights were engaged in various forms of preparation. Some honed their combat skills in sparring circles, their movements too fast for my human eyes to fully track. Others meditated in rooms, lined with psychic dampening fields, their minds shielded from the turmoil that was surely raging through the warp. Tech Marines worked on suits of Terminator armor, inscribing new wards and reinforcing existing ones against the increased chaos activity. The chapter prepares for war, I observed. Oricon nodded. War like none we have faced before. Not against a single enemy or on a single front, but across the entire Imperium, against the forces of chaos, emboldened by humanity's crisis of faith. We entered a large circular chamber dominated by a round table of black marble. Seated around it were figures representing what remained of Imperial leadership. I recognized several Inquisitors, including Lord Inquisitor Vaan, who had helped me gain access to Terra. There were representatives from the Administratum, the Ecclesiarchy, and even a Tech Magos who sat apart from the others, mechadendrites twitching nervously. Oricon indicated an empty seat. Join us, Inquisitor Vale. You have earned your place at this table, for better or worse. As I took my seat, I felt the weight of their gazes upon me. Some hostile, some curious, all burdened by the knowledge of what was happening to the Imperium they had served all their lives. The discussions that followed lasted for days. Reports flowed in from across the galaxy, each more dire than the last. The Imperium was fracturing along every existing fault line and creating new ones daily. The Astronomican's failure had stranded countless ships in the warp, while others emerged decades off course, their crews driven mad by extended exposure to the Immaterium without the guiding light of Terra. Planetary governors declared independence. Military commanders crowned themselves kings. Chaos cults emerged from hiding, swelling their ranks with the disillusioned and the desperate. The Adeptus Mechanicus civil war had spread to every Forge world, with some factions seeking to create a new machine god to replace the Emperor. Others, turning to the worship of the Void Dragon, a Khatan shard long rumored to be imprisoned on Mars itself. But amidst the reports of collapse and destruction, there were glimmers of resistance. Space Marine chapters establishing defensive perimeters around inhabited systems, Imperial Guard regiments standing firm against both rebellion and chaos incursion, inquisitorial conclaves forming temporary alliances with planetary defense forces to maintain order. Humanity, it seemed, was not willing to go quietly into the darkness. On the third day of deliberations, Grand Master Oricon called for silence. The chamber, which had been filled with the competing voices of Imperial representatives arguing over resources and priorities, fell quiet. "We have spent enough time diagnosing the disease," he said. "Now we must prescribe the cure, or failing that, determine how best to manage the symptoms." Lord Inquisitor Vaan, a gaunt man whose face bore the scars of countless encounters with the enemies of mankind, spoke first. "The truth cannot be unknown. Any attempt to deny Inquisitor Vale's discovery will only be seen as further deception. We must acknowledge the reality of the Emperor's condition." "And replace faith in the Emperor with what?" demanded Cardinal Olga Cherenko of the Ecclesiarchy, her voice sharp with anger. "Faith is what has held the Imperium together for 10 millennia. Without it, what remains?" "Faith in humanity itself," I suggested, speaking up for the first time in hours. All eyes turned to me. The Emperor, whatever else he was, represented the pinnacle of human potential. If he was not a god, then he was the greatest human who ever lived. one who sacrificed everything to protect our species from the predations of both Xenos and the Warp. I stood, addressing the table with growing confidence. We have spent millennia worshipping a being who, by all accounts, rejected such worship, whose original vision was of a secular human empire united by reason, rather than superstition. Perhaps, in losing our false god, we have the opportunity to reclaim that vision. The Tech Magos, who had introduced himself as Xerxes Holt of the Logos Historica Verita, a faction dedicated to preserving true knowledge rather than dogma, nodded in agreement. The data recovered from Mars supports this interpretation. The Emperor sought to free humanity from the shackles of religion, to elevate our species through science and reason. Pretty words, Cardinal Cherenko scoffed. But you cannot replace 10,000 years of faith with an appeal to reason overnight. The masses require something to believe in, something greater than themselves. Then let them believe in the truth, Oricon said quietly. The universe is more terrible and more wonderful than the simplified doctrine of the imperial cult has allowed them to see. The warp is real. The beings that dwell within it are real. The threat they pose to humanity is real. But so too is human resilience, human ingenuity, human courage. He placed his armored hands flat on the table, the sound echoing in the chamber like a judge's gavel. I propose the formation of a new coalition, not to restore the Imperium as it was, that is impossible now, but to preserve what can be saved, to establish strongholds of human civilization that can weather the coming storm, to gather knowledge, resources and defenders around centers of population that might survive what is to come. And who would lead this coalition? Varn asked. Without the Emperor, who has the authority? No single individual, Oricon replied. A council, perhaps. Representatives of those organizations still committed to humanity's survival rather than their own power. The Space Marines, the loyal elements of the Imperial Guard, the rational factions of the Mechanicus, the Inquisition, or what remains of it that values truth. And the Ecclesiarchy? Cardinal Cherenko asked, her voice tight with tension. Oricon met her gaze steadily. Those who are willing to adapt their teachings to this new reality, yes. Faith can be a powerful force for good when it is not built upon a foundation of lies. The Emperor may not have been a god in the traditional sense, but his sacrifice for humanity was real. His struggle against the ruinous powers continues, even if his consciousness has largely dispersed into the warp. There is still meaning there, still a legacy worth honoring. The discussions continued, growing more practical as hours passed. Plans were made for the evacuation of key personnel and resources from Terra before its inevitable fall to anarchy or worse. Lists were compiled of worlds that might serve as new centers of human governance. The Grey Knights offered Titan itself as a temporary headquarters for the Coalition, its psychic defenses and isolated position making it one of the most secure locations in the solar system. As we delved into the practicalities of preserving what could be saved from the collapsing Imperium, I found myself increasingly drawn to the reports of unusual warp phenomena that continued to come in from across the galaxy. Astropaths reporting visions of a golden light moving through the immaterium, navigators speaking of new currents in the warp, patterns they had never observed before. Space Marine librarians experiencing shared dreams of a presence that was neither human nor daemon but something else entirely. During a brief recess in the Council's deliberations, I approached one of the Grey Knights' librarians, a warrior psyker named Hyperion, whose reputation had reached even my ears. His psychic might was said to be among the greatest in the chapter, his mind a weapon as potent as the force halberd he carried. "You have questions about the warp," he said as I approached, answering before I could speak. "About what is happening there since your discovery." I nodded, not surprised that he had read my surface thoughts. "There are reports of something moving in the immaterium. Something new, or perhaps something very old, that has been changing." Hyperion's eyes, a startling silver that seemed to reflect light that wasn't present in the dimly lit corridor, fixed on me. "It is both new and ancient, Inquisitor. The being you knew as the Emperor has indeed been dissipating into the warp for millennia, but that energy, that consciousness, has not been destroyed. It has been transformed. Into what? I asked, feeling a chill at the certainty in his voice. That is the question that occupies many of our chapter's most powerful psykers. When a human dies, their soul typically passes into the warp, where it may be consumed by the predators that dwell there or simply dissolve into the broader sea of consciousness. But the Emperor was no ordinary human. His psychic power was vast beyond comprehension, and for 10,000 years, he has been the focus of worship for trillions of human souls. You're suggesting that the Emperor, or what remains of him, has become a warp entity in his own right? A god, in fact, if not in origin? Hyperion's expression remained neutral, but I sensed a gravity in his response. It is a possibility that we cannot discount. The warp is shaped by consciousness, particularly the collective consciousness of psychically sensitive species like humanity. The Emperor may have rejected divinity in life, but in death, or in whatever state exists beyond what we understand as life, the collective belief of humanity may have transformed him into something that, for lack of a better term, we might call divine. As the council reconvened, I found myself dwelling on Hyperion's words. Could it be that the Emperor, who had fought so hard against the worship of gods, had himself become one through the very religious devotion he had opposed? And if so, what did that mean for humanity's future? As the council adjourned for the day, I found myself standing beside Grandmaster Oricon at the viewport, looking out at Saturn's rings shining in the darkness. "Do you believe it can work?" I asked him. "This coalition? Can humanity survive without the Imperium?" "The Imperium is not humanity," he replied. "It is merely the current political arrangement of our species. Humanity existed before the Imperium, and it may exist after, in different forms perhaps, under different laws and customs. But our species has survived worse cataclysms than this." "The age of strife," I murmured, thinking of the ancient dark age that had preceded the Emperor's unification of Terra. "Yes, and we emerged from that darkness, did we not? Not unchanged, not unscarred, but we survived. We adapted." He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "You have carried a heavy burden, Inquisitor Vale. The weight of truth is not easily borne." I laughed bitterly. "I destroyed the Imperium. Trillions may die because of what I discovered, what I revealed." "No," Oricon said firmly. "You did not destroy the Imperium. You merely exposed the rot that had been consuming it from within for millennia. A civilization built on a lie cannot stand forever. Better it fall now, when something might be salvaged, than continue until nothing remains but the lie itself." His words offered little comfort, but they gave me something I had not felt since my discovery on Terra: purpose. If I had indeed been the instrument of the Imperium's downfall, then perhaps I might also be an architect of whatever came next. Not redemption. There could be no redemption for the lives already lost, and those yet to be lost in the coming anarchy, but perhaps a kind of atonement. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the Council's work. My knowledge of inquisitorial strongholds and hidden caches of technology proved valuable in planning for the preservation of critical resources. My contacts among the more rational elements of the Administratum helped identify which worlds might be most receptive to the Coalition's overtures. One evening, as I worked late in the small chamber that had been assigned to me, I was visited by a grey knight I had not met before. He wore no armor, only a simple robe, and his head was completely shaven. The psychic hood he wore marked him as a librarian, though of a rank I could not determine. "Inquisitor Vale," he greeted me, his voice surprisingly gentle for one of the Emperor's finest warriors. "I am Epistolary Thalos. I have been tasked with sharing something with you that may provide a measure of comfort." "Comfort is in short supply these days, Epistolary," I replied, gesturing for him to sit. "But I welcome any you can offer." He remained standing, his posture formal. I have been monitoring the warp since the revelation of the Emperor's condition became widely known. The psychic shockwave of collapsed faith has created turbulence in the immaterium unlike anything recorded in our archives. But within that turbulence, patterns are emerging, new currents, new formations, similar to what our navigator reported during our journey here, I said, recalling her words about something vast and golden moving through the warp. Thalos nodded. Exactly so. What your navigator sensed, I and others like me have been studying more directly. The psychic energy that was once concentrated in the Emperor's physical form on the Golden Throne has indeed dispersed into the warp. But it has not been destroyed or consumed by the predators that dwell there. Instead, it appears to be coalescing into a new form, drawing to itself the psychic resonance of human faith that has been directed toward the Emperor for millennia. I leaned forward, intrigued despite my exhaustion. What are you saying, Epistolary? I am saying, Inquisitor, that the death of the God Emperor may be giving birth to an Emperor God. Not a corpse worshipped as divine, but a true warp entity born from the collective faith and will of humanity, an entity that, unlike the Chaos Gods, does not feed on our fear or rage or desire, but on our hope, our courage, our determination to endure. The implications were staggering. If what you say is true, then the Emperor's consciousness, or whatever it has become, still exists. Still watches over humanity, perhaps even more directly than when it was bound to his physical form. That is our belief, yes. Thalos's expression remained solemn. But do not mistake this for a simple continuation of the Imperial cult's teachings. This entity, if it truly exists as we perceive it, is not the Emperor as he was. It is something new, something that has been shaped not just by his original consciousness, but by 10,000 years of human belief. It may carry his memories, his will, his purpose, but it has been transformed by the collective psyche of humanity in ways we cannot fully comprehend. 2 weeks after my arrival on Titan, our deliberations were interrupted by an urgent report. A massive warp storm had engulfed Terra, cutting it off completely from the rest of the galaxy. The few astropathic communications that made it through before the blackout told of demonic incursions across the planet, of the Imperial Palace itself, under siege, not from human rebels, but from the servants of the ruinous powers. The Grey Knights prepared for immediate deployment, a full brotherhood of battle brothers arming for war. Their mission was not to save Terra, that was already acknowledged to be impossible, but to recover what relics and personnel could be rescued before the cradle of humanity fell completely to chaos. I requested permission to accompany them. Oricon denied it. Your knowledge is too valuable to risk, he told me, and there is another task for which you are better suited. That task was to be an emissary to the remaining loyal worlds of the Imperium, to explain the truth of what had happened, and to extend the Coalition's offer of protection and partnership. It was a mission that would take me far from Terra, far from the heart of the catastrophe I had unleashed, but not from my responsibility. The preparations for my journey were swift but thorough. I was provided with a modified inquisitorial vessel, faster and better armed than my previous ship, a complement of Grey Knights, a squad of 5 battle brothers led by Brother Captain Gaius, would accompany me, both for protection and to lend weight to the Coalition's proposals. Astropaths, navigators, tech priests, all carefully selected for their skills and their ability to adapt to the new reality we faced. Before the Grey Knights departed for their desperate mission to Terra, Oricon shared with me one last piece of information, a theory that had emerged from our analysis of the data recovered from Mars. The Emperor's consciousness, though dissipated, is not truly gone, he said. The psychic energy that was his being has been slowly absorbed into the warp itself over the millennia, not destroyed, but transformed. Into what? I asked. That is the question, is it not? The warp is a reflection of collective consciousness, particularly human consciousness, due to our psychic sensitivity as a species. For 10,000 years, trillions of humans have directed their faith toward the Emperor. That psychic energy had to go somewhere, had to become something. I considered the implications. You're suggesting that the Emperor, or what remains of him, has become a true warp entity. A god, in fact, if not in origin. Oricon nodded. It is a possibility. One that might explain certain phenomena we have observed. Grey Knight battle brothers have reported visions in the heat of combat against demonic entities. Visions of a golden light that burns away corruption. Some have even claimed to hear a voice, though the words are never clearly remembered after the fact. If true, I said slowly, then the irony is absolute. The Emperor, who rejected godhood in life, may have attained it in death through the very religious worship he opposed. The universe is seldom lacking in irony, Inquisitor Vale, Oricon said with the ghost of a smile. And the warp even less so. If the Emperor has indeed become a warp deity, then he is unlike any other. Born not of a single emotion or desire, but of humanity's collective will to survive, to overcome, to endure in the face of overwhelming darkness. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the weight of his Terminator gauntlet heavy but reassuring. Keep that possibility in mind as you travel to the loyal worlds. The truth you bear is devastating, but this additional truth might offer a kind of hope. Not the false hope of divine protection, but the more subtle hope that our collective will, our collective belief, has power in itself. That humanity, united in purpose, if not in politics, might still forge its own destiny. The Grey Knights departed the following day. A strike force of silver armor and psychic might bound for the roiling warp storm that had swallowed Terra. I watched their ships vanish into the immaterium, wondering if I would ever see Oricon or any of them again. 3 days later, I departed as well, aboard a modified inquisitorial corvette named the Veritas. With me traveled representatives from the Coalition, each chosen for their skills in diplomacy or their connections to the worlds we would visit. Our first destination was Hydrapur, an Imperial Navy stronghold that had so far maintained its loyalty to the idea of the Imperium, if not to Terra itself. As our ship entered the warp, I stood in the observation bay, watching the swirling madness of the Immaterium engulf us. Without the Astronomicon, navigation was treacherous, but our navigator, a woman named Elindra from House Belisarius, the same house as the navigator whose interrogation had first set me on this path, assured us she could guide us safely. "The warp has changed," she told me, her third eye covered by an ornate golden diadem. "But not in the way one might expect. There are new currents, new patterns forming. Something is being born out there, Inquisitor. Something that has never existed before." I thought of Oricon's theory about the Emperor's consciousness becoming a true warp entity. "Can you sense it? This new presence?" Elindra's expression was difficult to read, but I detected a hint of wonder in her voice. "Not directly, no. But I can see its effects. Areas of the warp that were once turbulent are now calm. Predators that once would have been drawn to a ship like ours are fleeing from something they fear more than hunger." "What could daemons fear?" I asked. "Extinction," she said simply. "The very concept of their unbeing. The warp is thought-given form, Inquisitor. If enough humans believe in a power that can unmake the ruinous powers, then that belief itself becomes a weapon." As we journeyed deeper into the churning tides of the Immaterium, I reflected on the incredible irony of it all. The Emperor, who had sought to free humanity from the shackles of religion, had become through his very denial the focus of the greatest religion in human history. And now, that collective faith might be transforming him into exactly what he had fought against, a warp god born of human belief. But perhaps this new entity, if it truly existed, was different from the Chaos Gods in a fundamental way, not a parasite feeding on human emotion, but a symbiote empowered by human will, not a tyrant demanding worship, but a creation of humanity's collective desire for protection and guidance. In that possibility lay a slender hope for the future. Not the restoration of the Imperium as it was, that was impossible now, but perhaps the birth of something new. Something that honored the Emperor's original vision while acknowledging the reality of humanity's need for something greater than itself to believe in. Our journey took us through regions of the warp that should have been impassable without the Astronomican's guidance. Yet somehow, our navigator found paths where none should have existed. More than once, we encountered demonic entities drawn to the psychic beacon of our ship's Geller field, only to see them retreat when something golden and luminous appeared at the edge of our perception. "It guides us," Elindra whispered during one such encounter. "It shields us. Whatever it is, it wants us to succeed." The words of epistolary Thalos came back to me. An Emperor God. Not the corpse on the throne, but something new, something born from the collective faith and will of humanity. A warp entity that, unlike the Chaos Gods, did not feed on our darkest emotions, but on our hope, our courage, our determination to endure. Could such a being exist? And if it did, what did that mean for humanity's future? Was this new entity truly the Emperor's consciousness transformed, or was it something else entirely? Something that merely wore his face because that was the form humanity expected its savior to take. As the Veritas carried us toward the first of many worlds that would determine humanity's fate, I found myself offering something I had not offered in decades, not since I first took the oath of the Inquisition. A prayer, not to the God Emperor as I had once understood him, but to whatever remained of the man who had sacrificed everything for humanity's survival. To the psychic echo of his will that might even now be coalescing in the warp into something new. "Guide us," I whispered into the swirling madness beyond the Geller field. "Not as our master, but as our creation. Show us how to survive what is to come." And somewhere in the depths of the immaterium, in a realm where thought and emotion take physical form, I could have sworn I heard an answer. Not in words, but in a sudden sense of purpose, of clarity amidst confusion. The path ahead would be long and fraught with danger. The galaxy would burn, old certainties would crumble, and countless lives would be lost in the transition from what was to what might be. But humanity would endure. Changed, scarred, perhaps even reduced to a fraction of its former numbers and territory, but it would survive. And in that survival lay the seed of eventual rebirth, of a new understanding of our place in the universe and our relationship with the powers beyond the veil of reality. The Emperor was dead. Long live humanity.